having had a recorded dialogue that I haven't uploaded yet, and also then something that wasn't recorded, but I had an argument with two people, which turned out pretty well. And I think we got down to the core sort of philosophical thing. And the people that I had an argument with uh, weren't social justice warriors themselves, but were sympathetic to the general notion. They sort of thought as a cultural movement it had some moral basis, or some moral purchase on their way of thinking. And that gave me, I think, a better insight into how to tackle the issue, um, in terms of at least simply explaining it out and such. And so, with recourse to both of these things that I've been through recently, I wanted to make a video that just kind of encompasses this stuff. And there are. I also wanted to upload this dialogue, but I'd need to put disclaimers on it that the discussion of these issues do not exhaust the issues. And then also I bring up feminism, and that really I need to bring up as its own issue and properly contextualize um, the elements that I was trying to emphasize within it, because that was not done when I brought it up. It is a somewhat a bigger topic. It is also somewhat a historical topic in terms of where a lot of this fascist value system comes from, that and how it's been injected into our culture through the tactics used essentially as they were developed by arguments within second wave feminism, essentially. Uh, but as a general example as well, it's a good way of tackling issues of generalization itself, and the moral significance of generalizing, and where that fits in with uh, ethics and morality and such. And in some sense, I was talking about feminism within the same voice as sort of contending with the style of feminist arguments and how prone they are essentially to collapsing under their own structure if you just merely look at the other side of the equation, i.e., men, and you look at uh, uh, the problems that women have generally sort of uh, inflicted on society and on men. And although the narrative within and going into sort of how narratives get cherry picked, and sort of, and that just understanding both sides still doesn't help you at all if the fundamental philosophical framework that you're using to track these issues is flawed. This relates to a practical claim that identity politics is not a soluble way of framing anything about life, that if you use it, and sort of the notion that if everyone just gets into identity politics, that there's somehow a way of mediating out a just solution for all. It's absolutely impossible. But I want to get into the philosophical sort of issue of that. And then I perhaps also want to talk about how the philosophical issues perhaps correspond to certain personality styles, um, and how those personality styles are a lot of political thinking in itself is modeled after, or is more closely related to, the functioning and sort of the mechanics of processing information of some people rather than others. And I've really tried to make the claim that people have, in as much as that you can create a somewhat a philosophical typology or something like that, people are not simply going to have separate and equal ethical standings. Not everyone is going to be equally ethical in some sense. And in fact, to have a functioning society, you do need to suppress the values of some personality styles, or at least the excesses, or at least create a culture that hopefully, I mean, there are some defects that some personality styles have that can be corrected by a sophisticated enough culture. And this is something that also touches on feminism. If you understand how the Russian aristocracy essentially had an ethical equality between the sexes, it was very ahead of its time in that sense, and how they regulated sexual or the sexes in terms of relating to one another. It was very good at removing what would otherwise be prone to a kind of toxic corruption. And anyway, so in culture as a technology for humanity, looking at it in that way, in how it sort of deals with the excesses of personality styles, and how that all relates to the fundamental philosophical sort of issues as well. So let me just start off within kind of just first principle thinking and basic stuff. So within politics or social politics or something like that, you have the conception of human beings, people. How do you think about people? And I think that is actually the fundamental question that identity politics gets completely wrong. So, what are people? Are they individuals or are they identities? In essence, are they groups of people with shared interests? And although people can also have groups, to continue, I was slightly interrupted. They can have a grouping description or a group description put upon them. They can subscribe to group descriptions. So, people can relate to groups, to collective identity. And they can be related to groupings and collective identity by others. Fundamentally, even if people do this, you have to, there is a divergent distinction made at the start, that is it the individual that is according this, or does it become a kind of objective fact? And I mean that in a principled way, in terms of fundamental ethics, not in terms of some kind of worldly claim. So in some context, yes, in some worldly context, you can say that in some sense they are that according to the system or something like that. But according to the individual, that doesn't still answer. It doesn't answer the question for the individual. That will never answer the question for the individual. So now I've already sort of, I don't quite remember the flow because of the interruption that I had. But so let me just perhaps start again. So the answer to the question, what are people? It simply does not just get automatically confused when people are targeted because of their group identity, that then there should be a symmetrical solution to that problem where they are benefited because of that group identity. Or that rather that the group identity should be benefited to help the people who were targeted because of the group identity. You see, so there are two separate things here. Helping individuals because they were targeted because of their group identity, that is fine. That is what justice requires. But promoting a group identity, that is not really justifiable. In the South African Constitution, it says that you can essentially, can't remember the exact phrasing, if it's compensate or help the achievement of equality to persons or groups of persons who were previously disadvantaged. It doesn't say it explicitly, and on this point, I would argue it's not ambiguous within the purport of the text. It should be trite, that essentially people should not receive the benefit of programs simply because they are part of a group that was previously disadvantaged, but because they were previously disadvantaged. And so, for example, it's not enough to just say, to tick on the form that you were previously disadvantaged. It's that you were previously disadvantaged. You were part of a group that was It's not just to tick on a form that you're part of a group that was previously disadvantaged, but that, in essence, there's a further qualification that means that that previous disadvantage is in effect. So, for example, poor black people could be, within the constitutional language, specifically a group of people that needs special promotion for the achievement of equality. That is justifiable. But the idea that you just belong to a group that was previously disadvantaged, that you get some benefit, to me, it's, if you actually read the logic of the argument and you're careful in your reasoning, instead of just sort of resorting to image morality, where it's where the principle essentially gets completely lost in just this sort of this fuzzy image, which essentially is where the general moral corruption comes in. When you've got this sort of oversimplified method that, oh, well, obviously, if we just invert the damage in terms of how the damage was applied to people, or the reason that the damage was caused should be the reason, that the inverse of that reason should be how it is solved. The idea that has an innate logical symmetry, I mean, is literally retarded. That is the worst kind of thinking that you could have. Essentially, that was the argument of the Nazis, that because they had been infiltrated by another identity group, that they needed to be paranoid and balkanize a safe space for their people, essentially. I mean, that's how fascism works. It's a reactionary argument. That's why they can say that, no, we're on the left, we're socialistic. I mean, the Nazi Party was a socialist workers' party. That's how it promoted itself. But, with the kind of non-principled thinking that they use, that is how essentially they always facilitate the functioning of business to be something that requires political connection and favor in order to essentially facilitate and conceal the corrupt apparatus, because it seems completely consistent with the image of the image reduction of what you and therefore displacement of ethical principle. So you end up with this very corrupted moral code that can be sort of positivistically quantified by people, and then people feel very secure about that because essentially it gives them the power of revenge. It gives them the power of circumventing principles, like, for example, the rule of law. Even, it corrodes and undermines everything. It's so patently destructive, in a very kind of essential way in which equality no longer becomes a principle, it becomes an adjective that attaches to the identity and not to the individual. See, like in terms of equality attaching to an individual, that requires principles to make that happen. Whereas if it attaches to the identity or the group or the collective, you can uh, you can authorize and validate any number of corruptions and conceal the invisible intervening hand of the government that can say, no, well, we're promoting the identity, so it doesn't quite matter if we create one very rich black man in business or empower individuals that actually need assistance in a particular circumstance. Because they don't have to go through the rigor of setting up those qualifications, of identifying how to apportion assistance from the government, because they've just got this catch-all previously disadvantaged group. That essentially you can only benefit a previously disadvantaged group if the group is qualified by its present disadvantage. And, this is also where it gets convoluted by arguments of structural racism. This is also why they create a whole lot of, why proponents of identity politics so endorse this vague, generalized sense of oppression that somehow is shared collectively by collective experience. It's as fascist as the kind of, we share the same blood, we share the same we share the same destiny. And so, yeah, could have perhaps dealt with that separately. So, let me perhaps illustrate some of these points. When people morally charge up their membership in a group, they are effectively relinquishing even the concept of dignity and instead adopting pride. When people place moral consideration in the group itself, and that the moral consideration of individuals is secondary to the moral consideration of groups, they have effectively become, they have been embedded with the values of a fascistic mentality, and this has been a cultural movement now. This is something that perhaps requires something of its own description, but I think there are circumstances in which euthanasia on an individual principled basis, it would be very hard to construct that a good enough sort of system to facilitate that, to sort of assuage all the principles that have to be overcome. But the idea that the individual can sort of bypass a kind of an ethical standard because they're simply doing it to themselves, or that they are consenting to something. It is in the same vein as thinking as that slavery would be okay if you could find people to consent to it. So there are hard moral principles that have to sort of, you'd have to find a way of engaging with those, and that is complicated and hard to do these things. But we've sort of been taken over by this sort of wave that, in some sense, individuals don't contend with principles, they contend with identity issues. And in as much as that they have an identity and they represent the pride of that identity's pride is not equal to others if you make them answer questions, if you make them sort of live up to principles. So you can sort of allow people just to kill themselves. You can allow teenagers with mental illnesses to have the right to euthanasia because they're just because otherwise you're being ageist and you're being mentally healthist or whatever. It's too easy to sort of to presume. It's very convenient to have that because then you can just sort of have, well, in some sense, the only thing that the individual is responsible to is preserving the pride of their identity. And we know that we'll have social justice and that our societies will be just when each of those identities share an equal share in everything that is regarded as positive. I mean, it's a very image conscious way of deriving a moral schema. I mean, I don't really think it's hard to even call it a morality because it's not capable of preserving itself. It will go insane very quickly, in some sense, because that picture is not enough for humanity. Essentially, you will have to create a scapegoat. You will have to sort of have this endless idea as to who is spoiling the cake, sort of who is infiltrating us, who is our minds still have not been decolonized, and we have to extract the missing puzzle piece, or we have to excavate history, and the only way of doing that is through the implements that we have before us in the present. And so essentially we go to war with the world. That is the general ideological structure that is built into this, is a kind of something else has the moral we just have to be skeptical about their integrity, and they have to prove the negative of our accusation, and in so doing they deliver to us the thing that we're missing. And so there's just this moral hazard that there is no ever a sense of independent autonomy, because that is controlled collectively through the identity, through the concept of the identity and the standing of the identity. And so because you've got this sort of facilitation of individual self-esteem that has no, it doesn't meet the proper challenge that the general notion, the original notion of integrity and dignity of the individual requires. And so, in essence, they just have to go through this, identity proponents just have to go through, am I guilty for this condition or am I innocent? Because if I'm innocent, if I'm not guilty, then I must be innocent. And if I'm innocent, then somebody else must be guilty for this condition. And therefore, it is their job to provide it. There's no spectrum of alternative levers of, well, maybe I should be anxious about this. Maybe I don't know everything. Maybe anxiousness is the start of a journey to building a confidence, or finding what is missing, or diagnosing the situation in terms of an independent navigation of the journey, instead of adopting the identity way of navigating life, the identity image conscious replacement of principles. So there are no principles anymore. There are no sort of so it really is the idea of the removal of law and the imposition of what can only be conceived of as the law of man, sort of at the whim of the ad hoc intervener, the savior of the identity, which has a German word, the Führer, and so the concept of the Führer already is alive in politics. Even there are contenders for it, and so it is quite disgusting when you see people on both sides of the aisle essentially pandering to people based on that basis, which is effectively the hollowing out of well, yeah. So trying to think of a better way of putting the metaphor in which it's hollowing out the public sphere and public discourse so that it can only people who represent identity in some kind of identity drama persist within it. Now, you can say that Trump is somewhat sitting on the fence in terms of in terms of trying to appeal to a base in this, but I think it's very clear that these people are actually antithetical to identity politics. And the thing that they are endorsing, which the people on the so-called left and the so-called liberals are calling dog whistles, is actually something like the notion that identity does not govern your life and that principles and integrity do. That is essentially what people don't like about Trump. And they have to set him up as an identity-centric figure, essentially in order to make sense of him in terms of their narrative, because if they don't like something, they still have to frame it in terms of their narrative. And so it is the opposition, as opposition is seen within the proponents of identity politics. It is someone advocating for the wrong identity when they should be advocating for another identity that would be the appropriate recipient of attention and focus. So it's this horse trading of who should sit in the innocent seat and who should sit in the guilty seat, and who should essentially enjoy a kind of unlimited, unbridled narcissism, and everyone else should consider all the extravagance and decadence just a kind of invisible kind of, and then they get the right kind of journalist to be dishonest about these inconsistencies with the ideology to sort of round it out nicely for them, to preserve the ideological mechanics at work here. I think ENTPs, I'm going to talk about personality styles here. I've discovered that ENTPs are prone to dishonesty. And I do think that these are the kinds of intellectuals that were generally in the leadership of the Nazis. I mean, they're the ones who have enough sophistication that they can come up with laws and things like that. But they really let the small nagging issues go. They can really believe in the ideology to the extent that they have to sort of tailor the narrative. And they are actually natural at doing that. They are natural at selectively remembering and changing their memories. Essentially because they don't track the substance of intellectual exchanges. They track their FE, their extroverted feeling policing of those matters. And sorry, this is jargon for some people, but so perhaps, if perhaps just stop listening, but I'm just going to read out some notes that I made. I already said that. ENTPs are dishonest, restrained only by what will promote FE, and I talk about them being essentially trolls in that sense. Nothing holding them back except what the group morality would allow to be concealed. If it can sort of pass the noticeability of the group morality, it can then be utilized or done. They are good ideologues for this reason. When I say that they are trolls, I mean employing dishonesty in order to operate within the group's morality. This is why fascism has a socialist rhetoric and also has business functioning through political connections and corruption, which will always destroy the hope and spirit of the independence of small business, for example, and aspirations of an individual to be empowered, replaced by images of group morality, identity dogma. So the interesting thing about the ENTP is that they are eternally righteous in themselves, and that is their fixed point of that sort of that extroverted feeling righteousness, tailoring the narrative through convenient certainties, revising memories to have those certainties that they can then rely on to keep that cord of FE righteousness. I'm using C.S. Joseph's model, but when I talk about other functions that they relate to. But what I've come to see is the most prominent function in each type essentially is the parent function and the trickster function. And so the parent function will generally displace and include the use of the trickster function. And so it will sort of adopt the it will abuse. Okay, let me just read this out because this is an example of what I'm basically trying to describe anyway. So the parent function is NE, that is a kind of their generalization machine, and then their parent TI, modeled at the expense and inclusion of an abused FI, which is their trickster, to support FE deployments, which amounts to attrition, trolling, manipulative tactics, where FE is never wrong. They are incredibly reluctant to leave recordings of their reasoning. Their form of substantiation is usually a hodgepodge of accumulated fragments that certifies their TI contention, which they toxically secure and insulate by derailing, insinuating, strawmanning, use of inductive evidence that is highly subjective or specious, or even dishonest to the point on depending on word games to convolute and preserve their good standing in terms of FE. They are autistic sophists, carried by the wave of whatever might be permissible with the crowd, which is my way of permissible with the crowd in this sense means their formulation of FE. And so they are pandering to the crowd. That is essentially what they are doing. They are essentially panderers of FE. And yeah. It's weird because I don't really see how they can, because you see the parent function is so prominent in the ego that and their hero function is NE, which is already basically just a generalization machine. They are just seeing generalized patterns about everything. And then they're creating TI models for the purpose of grandizing and sort of validating their FE. And essentially they're doing this at the expense of FI while thinking that they're very good at FI, but somewhat abusing it, and also in some sense, what the parent function also does through the abuse of the trickster, and I mean this in a kind of metaphysical sense, they are, I believe, at the same time. This is a contention that I have, is that the nemesis function effectively is being elements of the nemesis function, which in the ENTP's case is NI, is being buried under the foundation of the child function. And so the child doesn't even know that it has been elevated by those sorts of those caskets and sort of those that unceremonious funeral that just sort of goes by. And so their nemesis function nemesis function is not that important to look at directly in this particular correlation, but the when you've got parts of your nemesis function that are essentially becoming completely blind place, you can't even see them anymore. You're not even looking at NI. It's a way of being blind. Like having SE demon. Essentially, they are blind to the facts on the ground. They are stuck in this ideological mechanism, essentially. So sort of they're stuck in this world of generalizations. And so to them, they are only close to the group, and they are only promoting the group morality. And there are key elements of NI which essentially are. This is not. I mean, a well-integrated person will have tried to integrate their trickster, and essentially will try to stop too much of this kind of negative interaction between the trickster and the parent. But basically, it's something like that the function of the trickster is being displaced by the parent, and in the utilization of the parent, the person thinks that they are covering the ground or the function of the trickster. And that is what makes them, because having TI already is problematic, because TI can never, ever give you any certainty at any time. Thought, it's people, I mean, yeah, and this has a general, okay, now I'm going to make a general cultural philosophical claim that we live in a time in which the TI cult has essentially taken over. And this also has a lot to do with misunderstanding science, and the authority that science carries, I think, is the model that identity politics has adopted. So TI, the core of thought, the heart of thought, can never be right or wrong. Thought can never be right or wrong. It can only appear to be right or wrong, and actually, to be more technically specific, it can only appear to not be self-inconsistent. That's a double negative. It can only appear to not be self-inconsistent, because I'll give you my own definition of TI, which is actually probably, I think, the most philosophically in tune one, which is that TI is the determining a substantiation and applying that substantiation to a correlation. So it's two things simultaneously. You have to generate a substantiation, and you have to apply that substantiation onto a correlation. Now, this is fundamentally insoluble in some sense, because you can never observe a correlation to be causative. It does not occur. It's impossible. So TI essentially is always is essentially it's making a contention in some sense, but it's fundamentally tenuous, it's fundamentally tentative, And in as much as that it might appear to be true or untrue, that essentially, in terms of its truth value, is the only thing that you can say is that it might be true or it might not be true. So, like, people say the wrong thing about science. They say, well, science did this, so now we know that this could be true. That is wrong. They can say it might be true, but obviously they don't say that, because then it sounds like they're wasting everyone's time in terms of the value of truth, which in some sense they fundamentally always are. Because, well, I'm not going to get into that tangent, but science is broken. Philosophically, they broke it themselves, and, well, from Newton they broke it, but it wasn't. Newton didn't actually technically break it. In hindsight, he broke it. He made a gamble, and then that gamble turned out to fail, and then, turns out wasting everyone's time. But I mean, people told Newton when he was alive, they were like, well, you've created a description, a complete description of something, but you have not made any claim as to its cause. So how is that even empirically testable? You can test the description, but you can't test any kind of causative claim around it, because it's not making a causative claim. So what are you doing? This is the same thing identity politics has. It's a complete description, but it has no epistemic value. It's basically a conjecture. It's like, well, we could put everything into this paradigm. I mean, you could make practical arguments as to why that is an absolutely terrifying thing to do. And essentially, the way to keep that train going, essentially, is to engineer certainty within thought, which means that essentially you have to fix evidence that can't be questioned. You have to have dogma and orthodoxy. You have to have a narrative which no one is allowed to shake or challenge. You start having inconvenient, there are certain studies you're not allowed to do. They're too inconvenient for the program of social justice. There are too many sort of economic questions that you're not allowed to go into. For example, in America, Coleman Hughes, I need to double check on his name again, because I keep on thinking Hughes should be first name. Anyway, goes into the economics of so-called poverty and stuff like that. Like, if you actually look at the socioeconomic breakdown between different race groups, and you see that black women on average earn less than white women, but yet they have many, many, many more luxury cars and high purchase and expensive purchases of things like jewelry and things like that. And to sort of not put that into the mix of understanding, like how poverty replicates itself, or how lower socioeconomic outcomes occur within the American context. I mean, it's somewhat delusional. Anyway, there are things in the dialogue that somewhat relate to this, although these are things that sometimes you have to sort of carefully wade through them and deal with the whole issue. Otherwise, you become target to being taken out of context and such, which is, I guess, all too easy when you don't provide a full context. And that's what I'm afraid I did with the feminism. I don't know if I should go into that now, because there are ways of looking at the divides, the differences in the sexes, and understanding, let's say, the real consequences of these differences in terms of social power. That essentially women are suffering from the incredible so let me actually just find my notes on this and read it out. That will actually be better. And this a lot of the stuff is going to get very touchy, I guess, but it's a loose thesis, or it's actually not so loose, but I would say that it's quite comprehensive, but obviously I'm not putting in footnotes and things like that. But I think any evolutionary psychologist would broadly endorse, or it would be interesting to see exactly where. I mean, there might be some small errors which essentially could be just replaced with a more detailed thing that I might have sort of referenced something that would generally amount to the same sort of thing, but it's sort of, I'm certainly open to revising these things, but obviously not on the grounds of someone being offended. Okay, here we go. Because of the stark difference between the sexes in terms of the exponentially higher opportunity cost that women experience, especially early in their lives, women in general have a different vantage point, which is loosely explained by being severely cost averse in relation to all the opportunity costs that each decision or choice produces. The average resultant of these factors leads to someone who is overwhelmed by gaming a system because of a constant stream of positive reinforcement, while accompanied also by losing out of hypothetical alternative positive reinforcements, while also at the same time eventually realizing that the system of gaming has a limited duration, and somehow coping with the intransigence of this enacted belief about extracting and relating to the opposite sex and even society. The impersonal instrumentality and the disposable or interchangeable way of relating to exchanging the currency or the value within the dynamic between the sexes is regulated by not only the opportunity costs anticipated by a particular woman, but by the normative values that a woman adopts by by conforming with the gaming strategies of other women, which have an extensive impact on securing and depending on a stable calculus for tracking opportunity costs, so as to generate the confidence over settling on which costs are finally resigned and foregone. Although this is still cause for residual resentment, as the premise of these tactics is both impersonal, i.e., politically relating to a marketplace so as to impose regulatory consistency in the form of conventional culture that that governs relations between the sexes, as well as hypothetical in their and then after the brackets, as well as hypothetical. Okay, wait, let me just read before the brackets just to get the flow. As the premise of these tactics is both impersonal as well as hypothetical in their combined vision of an algorithmic navigation of life, which is itself both a cause of complaint against the external confluence of inconsistent accesses to exploitation, as well as creating a toxic politics of differential exploitation between women, unequally enjoyed and unequally secured, as algorithmic formula cannot ensure results to which the formula merely tends towards a correlation. And sophisticated men who also possess broader options in the sexual marketplace might also spurn a woman for presenting such a fickle and impersonal interface onto regulating and thus diminishing a belief in anything existing beyond a transactional mutual exploitation. In brackets, quid pro quo vacuousness. The opportunity, okay, this is a different paragraph. The opportunity cost differential can be overcome by adapting culture, and this doesn't need activism. It needs people who, as individuals, believe and behave differently from the norm and create their own successful trend of authentic individuality. But the moral hazard that women face is difficult, as this moral hazard is premised both in biology and the evolutionary success that normative behavior confers upon societies, i.e., it promoted the sheer numbers of a group and tends towards expansionary conquest in order to meet the anticipation of sharing a plunder that other men were not able to counteroffer. In spite of this zero-sum algorithmic calculus, men and society have had to develop ulterior models of value and status so as to provide a stable platform upon which to generate the peace and prosperity so as to constrain the naked facilitation of women's strategies of sexual selection, which exists in stark contrast with their inconsistent preferences that are required to conceal the selfish influences which this topic has itself remained a cultural taboo to openly regard, as to challenge the female cultural hegemony and correctly correlate the ontological processes that both led to and facilitate most of the abuse and degradation in society, albeit through acting out of its primary target for extraction, men. And before they are men, boys who are inducted who are inducted into the system of cultural exploitation, while also currently being consciously forced to adopt a narrative about a group guilt to justify the ideological enslavement to the ongoing convenience of female political exploitation of the sexual marketplace. Okay, this would be so sad if not for the opportunity that this affords those who do not partake in collective insanity, which is more starkly made obvious for the more serious consequences of its subversive treatment and disconnection from the reality of sexual mores and relations between the sexes, or to restate the commonly observed facts on the ground, instead of just ideological mantras and slogans designed to consolidate the toxic cultural hegemony that is both perpetuated by and demeaning to women. So I have to add some articles that sometimes I don't write these things that well. Feminism was the genesis of identity politics, the same way that it was in Weimar Germany, although all the issues involving a multiplicity of identity get collapsed in the face of making the philosophical practical. The rhetorical promise people receiving justice for each of their identity layers gets condensed into a single strain that becomes central and eventually suffocates the contentions and claims made by all the others, because of how fundamentally obtusely the ideology treats life. To keep the ideology true, it must get more and more paranoid about its self-referencing presumption about pristine innocence, eventually discarding all but one identity vehicle through which to imagine extracting justice through and from. So I'm going to continue to read on more, but I just want to give some commentary on this. Like when I deconstruct, this gender divide thing, which is also evidenced by the idea that men are fundamentally disposable if you understand it from an evolutionary point of view. Essentially, if you are born a woman, you are part of, historically speaking, you get to have children almost basically automatically if you can. Women do suffer more from infertility than men do. And some biological problems in that way. But generally, all women that can have children get the opportunity. That is not the same for men, taking it from an evolutionary perspective. Twice as many men as women have essentially just been genocided for being essentially inferior men. So in some sense, there is a huge amount of pressure to put on men to create value, extra value that they can offer society and then profit on in terms of using their status to trade essentially for women's hypergamy. And so this general formula also made us more successful against other humanoid species. Because the men would go out and risk their lives, and they would fight against other tribes of other humanoid species, and the men would fight against men and women of those other tribes. And so when there were casualties, our casualties were only men, and their casualties were men and women, and our women were safe. Therefore, we essentially outbred all the other humanoid species because of our specialization. That was one of the facets of it, is that the men were disposable in that way. And not only in that way, some men just did not, because essentially monogamy uh, was not was not the rule in terms of evolutionary history, essentially. And so women's selective pressure, their sexual selection of men is, I mean, if you want to blame men for being men, you really have to blame women for selecting the men that they chose, evolutionarily. And so, in some sense, this is also why men are much more dispersed throughout the spectrum, and women are much more clumped towards the median. So, women tend towards the median, and men are either incredibly stupid, or they're more often incredibly stupid or incredibly intelligent. And that is essentially that comes from our evolutionary past, because if you have to sort of risk something to try to be exceptional, because otherwise you're just not going to be able to provide the value that is going to allow you to continue to be part of the gene pool, essentially. And essentially what I was saying in some of those paragraphs is that men still experience this. This is still how the sexual marketplace operates. It has not changed at all. But now what's put on top of this is that now men are expected to feel a kind of group guilt for being men. And that is a bit of a kind of insidious mindfuck. That's just too much of a convoluted inception into this ideological nonsense. And so I mean, some men already commit suicide, already use, I mean, men commit suicide much higher than any other demographic, essentially. And so sort of to put that general pressure that men feel, essentially, of having to provide that extra value, which even feminists, essentially are, they revel in it. So to sort of, it's a very invidious and disgusting form of, I mean, you can see almost the roots of fascistic thinking right there. The kind of the scapegoating and the kind of the blind propaganda, and even at the cost that it has in terms of the social fabric, just to make some kind of stupid structural claim, just essentially to try to secure the female hegemony of culture and control of yeah. Anyway, what's my point is that, be these conditions as they may, be the sexes different in some generalized senses. I mean, this does not mean that. Okay, well, I think I go on to sort of include the kind of the hope of a kind of individual-based society based on non-sexualism. Men have only had it so good since the modern era, where monogamy was made the only respectable norm, and enforced by a moral consensus. This stops some level of masculine disposability in terms of the slow genocide of inferior men. But this runs counter to the past and current general female tactic, who would generally prefer access to a higher status by means of extractive association. This concept that I'm bringing out, extractive association, I want to build on this because I do think that this is a kind of a cultural theme that you see it even in politics. You see it in sort of. I think this was kind of exemplified somewhat in the controversy with Joe Biden and the woman that was accusing him at the most convenient time possible while she was the campaign manager of somebody else. The opportunism afforded by the traditional route is sought to be preserved by women in the relations between the sexes. Even as it accrues costs to the dignity of being, any alternative is scarcely modeled within the culture as a viable form of success. And as that success is by nature in contrast to the algorithmic calculus, it is too ephemeral in contrast to the quid pro quo availability within contemporary culture. Sorry, I didn't even follow that myself. The opportunism afforded by the traditional route is sought to be preserved by women in the relations between the sexes, or the accessibility to that kind of free value. Even as it accrues costs to the dignity of being, any alternative is scarcely modeled within the culture as a viable form of success. Okay, that's a bit mealy-mouthed and actually has to be extended. But if you can just sort of vaguely follow the logic in that, although I didn't sort of specifically name, that actually requires the extension of one of those claims to include a greater description. Any alternative is scarcely modeled within the culture as a viable form of success. And as that success is by nature in contrast to algorithmic calculus. So basically, I guess the point here is that you need some kind of cultural pact in terms of how the sexes relate to one another, to get to somehow obviate the algorithmic calculus, or at least to ameliorate it, or to kind of sort of contain it within something in which people can actually try to perhaps redeem the dignity of being, or some sense of individuality. This seems like I did not follow my own thread that well when I was typing this. So I guess what I'm saying is any alternative is too ephemeral in contrast to the quid pro quo availability within contemporary culture, which is produced by the conformity that women are more acutely sensitive to monitoring, so as to purvey and utilize it to maximize opportunities of associative extraction. Addiction to social media, especially Facebook, and virtue signaling with little regard to ideological substance, etc., their biological interests that relate to the group, biological interests relate to the group, which I mean by that, society's well-being is also manifested in this differential of power. A simple example of sort of compounding the problem here into a single kind of question: will men and women as teenagers of the same age ever pair together as a stable model of parity within relationships? And I'm pointing out that the main problem with that is that, as an example, imagine the entitlement that frustrates that as an occurrence. So, like, where do the entitlements actually sit that stop people from actually of the same age from getting together? Obviously, there is a minority that will engage in relationships like that, that haven't fallen into the algorithmic calculus in some sense. Should, but there I bet even in those cases there is still a calculus of extractive association. And that's not really going to be. It's never going to be possible to get rid of that, especially as society does. I'm going to try and, I guess, revisit these issues because that paragraph was awful. But what was my point? if you want to look at society's sort of collective interest in some sense, it would make sense that societies that assist women to have stable families at stages of their life where it is the most healthy for them to do so, where it is the most healthy for the children to be born, that we have sort of, that our culture comes at least from conditions that favored that formulas that resulted in that, or cultural compositions that resulted in that. I probably should have neatened that up before trying to read it out. But some of the things that I've got written out are actually, well, let's see if this somewhat relates to it. No, I'm not going to read that out. Anyway, I again want to say that, like, thinking of women as a group, you know, again, this is something that I think men are more easily able to not do. Women are more prone to it because of the power afforded to them by a kind of conformist vehicle of having cultural power. But as I said, it has a toxic calculus that is attached to it, and that toxic calculus in itself stops being operative at a certain age. You know, you kind of, you grow out of the enjoyment of that differential power. And so I do think that a lot of the political turmoil that we have is kind of, it is in some sense archetypally modeled by that kind of the wish to have that system satiated, the wish to have that system fulfilled, or sort of instituted at a kind of at a pervasive level. I mean, I've said things like, the idea is not that women should not receive free drinks; it's that every woman should receive the same amount of free drinks, and it should sort of be you know, that's something like the extension that made its way into the gay pride, what's called the gay pride movement. I wish it were, I wish I wish it had stayed cleaner. I wish it had just called itself the gay rights movement, and now those words are somewhat interchangeable. You know, they end up sort of convoluting history with their morally charged emphasis that no, these things are interchangeable because that is how they see moral consideration. It exists as a property of the generalization. It does not exist as a property of the individual. When I say property, I mean, in some sense, I also mean consideration, and I also mean that, like, it sort of, that's what uh, what owns the you know, so it's like the group owns the principle of equality, not the individual. That contention is essentially the vehicle of using generalizations to bypass to bypass the notion of integrity, um, to just keep on pandering to the mob, as it were, to keep on pandering to a groupthink, that people have to be on the right side of. Yeah, so I mean, what I in my discussion, I mean, so in some sense, and perhaps some of those paragraphs were not that great, but I'm not married to this paradigm because I don't divide society up into men and women. You can have these observations; they're somewhat generalizations, like and so in that current context, you're allowed to have the right generalizations against the right target, but you can't have the wrong generalizations against some other target, that is considered the wrong target, or like there is no parity here. There is no equal principle that is applied to the logic. It's that no, this is a there is one dogmatic orthodox resolution to this thinking, and you have to wait in line. So it's sort of the idea that everyone is in put in the right place in the queue, as it were. Um, but obviously the failure in it is that the person who's at the front of the queue, essentially, and especially the people who represent the people who are supposedly in the front of the queue, they get an unlimited amount of power and rhetorical deceptiveness and dishonesty. They get to tailor the narrative in order just to get the queue to be, the idea is that no, we just need to get the queue respected by everything, by the courts, by the legal system, by the governmental structure, by the institutional setup, and then you've got a runaway fascist society, essentially. And that it all comes from the philosophical sort of thing, is that as soon as you've got this separate but equal image of morality instead of a principled based morality, yeah, okay, well, I guess I can't repeat myself anymore. Went through a lot of different issues, but I think that at least I'm much better in dialogue in terms of actually contending with people's actual belief structures and dealing with the things as they raise them and sort of responding to them directly. Um, I'm always sometimes afraid when I'm in a dialogue with a particular person that if I'm recording it, I'm not covering issues that would interest other people that simply aren't being raised or being followed through or sort of being concluded or given voice to. That's always dangerous, because you can take, especially when you're measuring things in terms of the image, a morality image, and not tracking the principles. And yes, the problem is that when you deal with things and you don't give a full principled account of how to assess that issue, it is it's all the more excuse to just rely on the image, because the image is more comforting and sort of more insulated, um, with the idea that it's going to find some way of being expressed, and that even at the cost of some insignificant or person who belongs to the wrong faction or something like that, or because it's our turn. And so if there is a bit of sadistic abuse that happens to facilitate the image of justice, because it's not, because, oh well, we don't want to deal with principles, we don't want to go through the rigor, we don't want to go through having the rule of law, having a state that makes sense, having a just state that has a just structure. The idea that expediency is going to be the handmaid of it's very interesting seeing I've always try to draw this point that there, between the so-called radical revolutionaries and the plutocracy that is controlling things and stealing things and being corrupt, there is a tremendous sympathy between these two groups. The ideology of the radical so-called revolutionary and the kind of the and the promises made to the identities where essentially the slogans that they put out are these images which are not ethical standards. And so they just facilitate they facilitate corrupt leadership. And I think a lot of the time these ideologues, especially the ENTP, they can sort of I think when they actually get in power, they kind of they realize that because when they sort of hold the actual seat of power, they actually realize how brittle the whole thing is, and they kind of get cynical. That sort of only when they're fighting for it that they have the sense that there is life in their rhetoric, that there is life in their propaganda, and that there is, and that there is a purpose in their dishonesty. Although I think ENTPs are somewhat, it's just, to them it's not dishonesty in as much as that the belief that they know that they are always righteous, and that, or it's like it's just because it's their FE child. So it's just this, that is what hooks them in to I mean, if they live within a sophisticated enough legal culture, which they are not trying to sort of displace and corrode, um, and they're not trying to become their own legal source of validity, if they can sort of be constrained by a but it is interesting, like, just because I mean, they will produce so many inconsistencies, even if they're not being called out on them. And in some sense, that is what creates their followership to be essentially like a cult. It becomes. I mean, this is why fascism generates itself like this. Um, it's a groupthink. I just want to elaborate on the moral images thing. So, because the moral consideration is vested in the group identity or the collective, rather than the individual that has to sort of be conceived of in terms of universal principles, that can obviously lead to differential assistance being given by the state, or etc., etc. Because moral consideration is vested primarily before the individual in the group, that allows political leadership to use symbolic references to moral images of justice. And so the sort of the facilitation of justice is condensed into symbolic representation, and symbolic signaling towards the image of justice, and that correlates to the identity. Now, that kind of symbolic hand waving is living in a corrupt society, is living in decadent, because that essentially gives political leadership an inexhaustible route to just divert attention by creating more symbolic references to the to leading towards the image. And so as long as they have something like the general confidence that they are representing the identity, so long as they can sort of make that claim that they are representing the identity, they are given an absolute free hand. And as long as that whatever policy that they put forward is symbolically appropriate towards facilitating the moral consideration that belongs to the identity, they can do whatever. And so what falls through the gap is effectively any kind of constraint against the abuse of power, any kind of, so the individual is just there to get in the way of this more important drama of sort of structural affairs that they have to be symbolically in sympathy with, they are forced to sympathize with. And so there's this sort of promulgation and complete suffocation of the private sphere of life that just gets wholly adopted by this runaway totalitarian culture of fascistic values in which only group considerations are measured and the individual is measured against the group's image of the just outcome. And so everything is tailored to fit that narrative, to make that symbolism pertinent and ring true and seem sound and certain. And so if the individual is making waves or making observations or speaking in such a way that is hate against the identity, so this is where hate speech really starts to become a real huge moral hazard, because hate speech makes sense in as much as it is protecting an individual, but in as much as that it's protecting an identity, and the individual is taking offense on behalf of the moral consideration that they believe the identity is owed, then already they're not defending their dignity, they're defending their pride of their membership in a group. And essentially the source and the locus of their identity is in this disembodied external description that essentially, or they convolute that or conflate that with fact. And as such, they are also prone to the symbolic corruption of morality, where essentially they can measure every behavior up to this image of equality in the identity, equality of the identity, into that. So equality becomes an adjective that belongs to the identity. As soon as you've got that sort of, that virtual paradigm, there is and people are allowed to use legal means or criminal sanction, essentially, to ensure that paradigm. Then already you don't have a free and liberal democratic society. Because what is interesting is that, in some sense, that level of offense that is being defended in the individual is not an offense against their dignity. It is, in some sense, an offense against their ideology, and also their, I would say that they have already robbed themselves of dignity in that sense. Because in some sense their individual dignity is completely codependent on a collective quantitative parity of pride. Basically it's hinged on something like the slogan "separate but equal." that is the sort of the premise of that way of thinking. Is separate but equal identities. And it really is confused. It has so many layers of confusion built into it, because how can something be separate, as in distinct, but then yet also equal? Then the equalness must be just in regard. It has to be in a kind of, in terms of some, I mean, how could it ever be measured? How could it ever be proven that the regard was equal? How could you test that? And so it's rife essentially with just it's rife with specious arguments that are open to being deployed, because you could always have a skepticism about it. You could always engineer a further way of needing to secure it through some means. Essentially, the only way to escape that level of sort of ideological accusation or complaint, the only way to sort of deal with that ideological complaint is saying, no, we believe in the same symbolic image of justice in the identity. So it forces a kind of conformity and agreement in terms of the identity being the center of moral consideration, and thus completely hollowing out and collapsing the interpersonal dimension of interaction between people. And so anything that happens between individuals is mediated by concern with how much regard is given to differing identities, and is that regard equal? Now, this is a complication which sort of emotionally charges this issue tremendously. And that is essentially because generalizations do sometimes have practical implications. They do have a pragmatic utility that can be used. Obviously, there is no excuse in using a generalization against an individual where one can ascertain specific certainty on the criteria that is otherwise being sort of indicated by the preemptive generalization. And so in some sense, generalizations can only ever be justifiably employed against people where it's a completely impersonal interaction, where it becomes an actual, so the example with this, and I might not be dealing with all the issues as comprehensively as I think Coleman Hughes did in his anti-racism lecture. I think he gave a very good explanation of this kind of issue, is that when in certain places, in certain cities in America, when you see perhaps young black adults or teenagers in wearing hoodies walking on a street, do you go to the other side of the street or do you walk past them? And in some sense, that really puts it all, that really brings these issues to the fore, because if you cross the road, you are saying that I am making a judgment call, and I'm basing that based on, first of all, sort of stereotyping your identity or recognizing some identifiable characteristic and drawing from the generalization in some sense. And so, like, I'm saying something not about you as an individual, but I'm saying something about your identity in that sense. Now, in some sense, I think this is emotionally rough, I think. But this is the level of thick skin that I think is actually required for us to have for to be capable of actually having a multicultural society, this kind of interpersonal sort of thing, where the person who's crossing the street is doing so out of concern for their own safety in some sense. They're making that practical calculus, versus even the impoliteness that they would feel that they were exhibiting. Which, perhaps if they were a good person, you could say you would hope that they would have that in their calculus. And in some sense, because of identity politics, there is this whole extra moral charge that the identity is the recipient of moral respect, not the individual. I have the opposite view. So I see that although in the immediate circumstance, it is certainly, one can imagine why there are invested emotions in that particular scenario. I mean, this scenario is somewhat generalizable to other issues and things like that. But this, I think, gets into grappling with practical reality. There are practical features which, in impersonal interactions, one can make judgments that are essentially based on a generalized survey of what would otherwise be known as commonly known facts. Obviously, if someone is the unawareness that people how can I say this, is that the idea that people can only be what you might generalize them into or stereotype them into consisting of. I mean, that I think that is really the mark of racism, is that if you're not able to distinguish between making a decision that is based on a likelihood rather than basing a decision where that likelihood generates a kind of solid state understanding that sort of completely chills the interpersonal reaction. And this is ironic because identity politics in some sense says that there's no difference between the individual that represents the identity and the identity. That there's no variety within the individual. There cannot be a variety. It's one collective experience. Which ironically creates this whole second wave of identity consciousness. It is interesting as well because I think that a lot of this stuff is exacerbated by people being unwilling to enter into any kind of conventional conformity in some sense of in at least sort of acting within their own purview of independent intelligence or in terms of their independent expression about something. So if you think that you are being unfairly stereotyped or something like that, I mean, I don't think that this can happen in too many instances. Or it will only ever happen in impersonal interactions. But in some sense, in the same way that women put a lot of effort into putting on makeup and such like that, in terms of facilitating something about their presence, there are ways and means of, there are tactics that can be used in some sense to sort of avoid recurring impersonal inconveniences and slights that some people might be more sensitive to than others. Some people might be more capable of rationalizing them rather than actually sort of erecting a whole system of identity politics to sort of I mean, in some sense, I do think that, I mean, I guess the identity politics would people would call this blaming the victim, but the inability of the victim of this kind of impersonal slight to not be able to somewhat empathize um, with the impersonal prejudice. I think that, you see, I'm trying to get to making this other point, which sort of illustrates this point more clearly in terms of like the example of this happening in an American city where it is known that perhaps in that part of town or a, something about the crime statistics or something like that. Um, in as much as sort of thug culture or gang culture has become a fashion trend. These things, you can start to see elements like this lining up, uh, so much so that you think that there is something of a buy-in to this kind of it's something like I mean, and this comes through. I mean, this is not relevant at all to the South African context, but in the American context, how people invent names for their children and they invent spellings for the names of their children. I mean, almost as if to stigmatize their child in the sense of unconformity with their surroundings. So almost that to force them, in essence, to sort of have to claim some focal point of generating something like identity consciousness to sort of make sense. Um, it's interesting because a lot of these identity issues you can sort of they almost have two parallel tracks of explanation that you can say that I mean, and this really applies much more to the American context, which has in general a more functioning economy in which there is still opportunity and such, um, or at least on a much greater extent that there is in America. But in some sense, you can say, well, it's identity politics, it's racism, or you could actually say, well, actually, a lot of this was actually caused by my mother in terms of how she constructed these things and how she deliberated or how little she deliberated in construing these conditions that I've had to carry with me. And so I either blame the system for not accommodating these things, which in essence uh, were were chosen in my household. They were my household or the people within my household are somewhat responsible for some of these conditions or somewhat responsible for some of this ideological baggage that essentially um, you know painting you into a corner of essentially buying into this identity racket. Perhaps that was some of almost the unconscious calculus. I mean, when I say unconscious in this sense, I don't mean that it was done um, from a belief centric that one in the same way that one can think on one's beliefs and eventually fish them out, but that your activities and your behavior and sort of the choices that you make are based on those beliefs, even if you don't sort of consciously pull them out as you're utilizing them, as you're sort of being guided by those beliefs. So it's like and in essence, this is how the kind of the psychological war of destabilization and disruption occurs. I mean, this is obviously. I mean, I'm just basically. This is somewhat of an example in a much more functional society in America, in which essentially people just speak English. Obviously, in South Africa, where we do have 11 official languages, but I'm saying that in the American context, in which people have effectively invented their own language, or invented their own different style of name and such, that itself is in order, in essence, to try to make identity a kind of a focal point of a self-sympathizing based narcissism, in which a lot of these things are essentially can amount to self-agonizing, a kind of self-antagonism that then gets projected onto the structure, the system that is sort of meant to chase after you in order to sort of provide you with some image, at the cost of whatever it may be. Now, that is not to say that people do not deserve compensation and justice for injustice that has occurred. That is obvious. None of these arguments, in essence, are against affirmative action. They're against corrupt forms of affirmative action that essentially are destabilizing and disruptive and offer no actual assistance. I mean, in some sense, the amount of people that would have actually benefited in this economy if we had absolutely no affirmative action and we sort of had a period, then you could have actually seen, imagine a system in which there was absolutely no program of affirmative action. You would actually have everything that happened would be because of essentially private charity, or because of business actually facilitating and creating their own programs. Then you could actually see how much perhaps people wanted to transform South Africa, but we didn't go that route. We didn't have that trust in the people themselves. We trusted government instead to sort of symbolically impose an image of morality that they could sort of gesture toward, and create and use that symbolism effectively to conceal vast amounts of corruption, which now it seems to there's so much little left to steal within the state that now they have to go after private property effectively. But yeah, there is an insoluble sort of problem in terms of the impersonal thing, and I think that problem really has to do with the looming, recurring issue as to how many people actually do think that generalizations are morally important and that identity actually does carry currency, carry moral weight. And the idea, for instance, that because people have been harmed and damaged because of their identity, because of the description of the group that they belong to, does that then somehow mean that then they must be that they are that group in terms of when they are being compensated and assisted because of the damage that was done to them? And the idea, I did kind of go over this sort of in principle, but I didn't laboriously kind of lay it out. But the only way that identity politics works is if you really have this idea that people of different races don't share the same socioeconomic conditions, or that somehow people that share the same socioeconomic conditions of different races are still essentially different. Which is really such a tenuous, pathetic kind of hypothetical argument. That oh well, they're missing differentials of group pride. I mean, it's fucking disgusting. That kind of pathetic complaint to justify a whole system of racist intervention. Um, as if, well, poor white people are still white, so they should still be happy. It's disgusting. I mean, and there's so many absurdities built into this. As if people, um, don't have mixed communities, and therefore, if you promote black wealth, that somehow that will trickle down into the black community, and that will fix the black community. Because you made a black millionaire through government's assistance. I mean, it is, or you made black middle class people even better off, and you promoted them. I mean, this is the level of thinking in policy that essentially is focused on the moral consideration of the group. But sorry, let me just get into laying down. This is somewhat to restate the point, but it is a convoluted and blind assertion, essentially, to say because people were targeted and damaged because individuals received unjust damage for the reason, and the reason that was given by the perpetrator was their group affiliation, that group affiliation is the thing that must be given the compensation rather than the individuals that were harmed, that somehow the compensation belongs to the group identity and not the individual. I mean, is just it it's not, it's crazy. I mean, you can see the sleight of hand occurring there. I mean, you can see the. I mean, and then essentially, because you have to promote the group as the solution, essentially, you are doing the same thing. You're just essentially, uh, you are using the same form of morality as the people who targeted you. You just you you're using the same form of morality as the people that did the targeting. If that is your criteria for, if you just use the same criteria for apportioning collective justice. Yeah, the notion of a collective justice. That is what is repugnant. That is utterly. I mean, it's fascistic thinking at its core. It's inexcusable. Delineating a group of people for special assistance means that the qualification in that group, the qualification in designating a group that is going to receive compensation or some kind of dispensation is inherently going to mean that the criteria is not just going to be it's going to have to be substantiated or qualified or include um, elements. So I mean, a good example would be not just previously disadvantaged, but currently poor and previously disadvantaged. That would be the a correct designation of a group uh, to receive special assistances and different programs uh, that try to sort of make up for things and sort of and promote something like access and to sort of fast track transformation. Uh, the idea that transformation is fast tracked by creating this vehicle of collective justice, which is generally going to be used to take revenge against a group of people that can't take put put a cross in that tick box or sort of they can't be included in that, is in some sense just a way to sort of divide society and create a consciousness around that distinction, that division of people who are included and excluded from that, and the kind of the I mean, a lot of the sort of the toxic identity politics, I think, is around kind of securing the level of institutional privilege that has been secured through identity politics. That sort of when, for example, um, black economic empowerment started having added rhetoric that was getting attached to it, that it has to be broad based black economic empowerment, and that essentially the poor aren't getting any real benefit out of black economic empowerment, then you really started to see the identity politics and the identity consciousness sort of ramp up. Because without that kind of radical noise about collective justice, there is no way for the leadership, essentially. I mean, first of all, there's no way for the field marshals to sort of be able to feel like they're going to war for their group. It's a very kind of fascistic form of tribal allegiance. It's kind of like a religion based on identity. Um, that you can sort of tangibly advocate for, like the black first, land first kind of politics. And I mean, what's gross is that these radicals are completely in a kind of ideological sympathy with the corrupt leadership at the top, because the symbolism of black first means that all it makes sense that the leaders are going to live in palaces because their lavish lifestyles are representative of the 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 integrity of the identity. They are token, uh, because I've said this before. It reduces humanity into this hive insect, and sort of everything is just promoting the hive. It's promoting the collective, and that there are these special roles. As you get the more you get the queen at the center of this. And so the leadership really inhabit a completely different relationship to economics, where essentially the idea is that all the identity will share evenly. But once you've got a state that is centered around that level of morality, there is no way of knowing, there's no way of checking on them because they have such a concentration of power. And you've essentially destroyed the principles of an open liberal democracy. After also gutting the Constitution effectively and betraying it. I mean, there are ways in which the state has been operating that is essentially fundamentally antithetical to the Constitution. I was thinking of making a recording. If I was the public protector, what would be the series of things to say and do? I mean, the level of kind of constitutional crisis which is posed by the current legislation on the table that effectively Parliament has already authorized racializing the property clause, essentially. That is what Parliament has already done. It has created the authorization effectively to bring racialist politics into a non-racialist document, the Constitution. I mean, it's already inexcusable. I mean, and the ANC has already made this part of their policy. So I mean, in some sense, you can argue that Parliament as a body has effectively it's gone rogue. I mean, generally I would tend towards sort of saying, well, maybe we need something. I mean, the original sin in the new South Africa was essentially that we only had a government of national unity for 2 years. We should have had one for much longer. In fact, there was a move to try and extend it, but that failed because essentially enough of the corrupt people in the ANC already wanted to start plundering the state. But I mean, just the loss in the effectiveness of government could have been ameliorated if we had a longer a more progressive move towards all the personnel changes and such in ministerial roles and things. So that people were more competent when they took on those roles. And we didn't have such a loss in, I mean, well, I don't even know if, all the losses that we've suffered are because of mismanagement so much as it was overt corruption and theft and plunder, effectively, and just sort of not caring about the functioning of the state and delivering services. And essentially that was done in the name of racialist pride. No, we cannot excuse having a longer government of national unity because we need to do it for our identity. So you really start to see that as soon as you give consideration to the identity, just reality just goes by the wayside. You forget about the people on the ground because you're doing it for the identity. That's how you can symbolically justify it. And so I mean, in some sense, I think you could justify having a government of national unity now, while at the same time effectively. I would push for a lot of things. The public protector doesn't really have so much power to do these other things, but I would suggest that the ANC essentially change its cadre deployment system completely, or at least, or in the alternative, roots out the element within it that is utterly corrupt. And if it is incapable of doing so, I would probably move to try and do something in the courts in which at least someone who can be seen as the most respected sort of politician within the ANC can be given the right to the name of the ANC and can sort of try to make an independent, separate party and then only absorb the people that are not blatantly corrupt, essentially. That there's a gate that is created to produce a rejuvenated party. If they don't have, or at least taking away the thing that they're trading on, which is essentially just the fumes of the historical integrity of the ANC. But yeah, there are levels of corruption there which I don't know if they can ever be. And I mean, perhaps these the political interventions are surely they might not even be worth suggesting. They're just so radically far impossible in some sense. But in some sense, if we cannot get to grips with what's really happening in politics, in 10 years' time, if things are just going to, I mean, like, if this racialization of the property clause can't be derailed, it can't sort of be slapped in the face and removed by the courts, um, can't slap Parliament in the face, um, and disgusting demagogues like Julius Malema, who effectively say we have a parliamentary democracy, where we do not have a parliamentary democracy, we have a constitutional democracy, where the justice of the individual can get redress against the collective society through the courts. It is important to me that the system of government, at least the structure of it, is preserved, because it is without parallel in the world. It does not exist. It solves a lot of problems. If we didn't have essentially an opportunistic, nepotistic government trading on essentially racialist sentiment and and sort of actually serious about dealing with transformation in a country in a responsible way, rather in a way that allows them to extract the most resources for themselves and for the politically connected. You know, we could have been in a very different position. But I mean, basically, if this is going to be the state of politics, if people are going to vote for disgusting monsters like Julius Malema, um, and his fascist politics, if they're going to buy into that fascist politics, then I mean, I guess we have to see how many people are voting for him where, and basically partition the country, or at least work out what provinces might be able to continue on with the constitution in an unmolested state. So at least the constitution is preserved. At least some form of the New South Africa can survive. Um, so that it would be the same uh, governmental structure. It will be the same form. It will just be a different territory. And then they can go create their disgusting experiment, and the ANC can continue its disgusting experiments on society, and they can see where that gets them. Um, I think one of the better ideas was perhaps at the start. If we just had a longer government of national unity, and there was enough good people within the ANC. I mean, there were always a good number of good people within the ANC, but effectively, uh, well, they have been lost. They have. Where is Palo Jordan in politics? And I mean, the kind of control that the government has over newspapers and such. It's and you know, the kind of the political friends of Julius Malema um, that own magazines and newspapers that have made money from doing deals with the government and getting government property. I mean, is that level of, well, I guess you know it's a model of things to come, really. Although when the general hope has collapsed for this society to be a free society of liberal values, um, and there's a kind of spiraling. I mean, you know, when you're going to sort of uproot the food supply, you're going to endorse this kind of political insanity. I mean, yeah, it's just. I mean, it's amazing just how destructive and destabilizing fascist politics is. But I mean, that's how it grows. It's like a cancer. Government owns 70% of all land in the country. I mean, it's easy enough for them to hand out parcels of land. We give less than 1% of the GDP towards land reform. There's a whole spectrum of tools and things to do before expropriation without compensation, which in principle already exists, but obviously it never, in essence, really. I mean, it happens in such rare circumstances that it's not worth changing the constitution over. The point of changing the constitution to facilitate this is overtly for political corruption, for political enrichment, and it's to insert racialist politics into the constitution. And Parliament has actually endorsed this. And that is going to be the lever that Julius Malema uses to stoke the fires of violence and revenge and civil war. I mean, yeah, I guess on some level you have to take. I mean, perhaps we haven't crossed the line yet. We haven't passed the Rubicon, but at some point you have to sort of consider partitioning the country preemptively in some sense. But there isn't enough sort of light put onto the sort of the toxin of identity politics. I mean, in the Western Cape, there is, you know, there are the remnants of so much identity politics, which effectively was absorbed from apartheid still in so many communities. It's still, but I mean, if we can keep the same legal structure and we can have uh, good enough governance the movement and sort of the unlocking of um, business and real growth in the real economy might be enough to actually show people that there is an alternative route. So depressing.